Sadly, I can't speak Spanish, and the few words that I have in Spanish in my presentation, I will probably mispronounce, so I apologize ahead of time. So I'd really like to thank everyone for coming out to celebrate the launch of my book, The Woman Who Changed Her Brain into Spanish, which is La Mujer que Transformó su Cerebro. So thank you. It's taken many, many people to birth this translation, and I'd just like to say a few thank yous to people I'm grateful. So the first person, Arpad von Lazar, who in his wisdom and generosity made the introduction to the publisher, to Marban Libros. And this book would not be a reality without Arpad, your support and championing the project. And also, it really doesn't hurt that nobody can say no to you, so because they have so much respect. So really, from my heart, thank you, Arpad. And to Omar Candil and Rita Margarita, and to the Rita Margarita Foundation for acknowledging the importance of this work, for being committed to build awareness that one doesn't have to live across their lifetime with a learning difficulty, and for funding the translation and publication of the book. So thank you. And for Nieves Segovia, a true visionary in the field of education, whose commitment and passion is really to fostering lifelong learning, which in her stewardship for the university and for the SEC International Schools, it is just so evident. I'm deeply grateful to your commitment and passion to hosting this event, for being such a strong and positive influence in changing the face of education, to making it an engaged process, a diverse process, and to really putting the learner as the center of that process. So thank you. And to Daniel Marban of Marban Libros, who so beautifully executed the translation of this book and really kept to the essence of the ideas and the feeling in this book. And I could not have asked for a better publisher to take this book out into Spanish. And to someone also, because when I meet people, I can't help myself but to think about their cognitive abilities. And Daniel has probably the most amazing, exceptional spatial ability of anyone I've ever met. I don't know if people know he also is a racing car driver, and I had the joy of being a passenger as he drove on the highways around Madrid, and his spatial ability is exceptional. So thank you. And I dedicated my book to a Russian neuropsychologist, Alexander Luria, and I really feel that I owe a life debt to Luria. If I had not come across his work in 1977, I would not be alive. I would not be here speaking to you today because of the struggle of my learning difficulties. So that's why I dedicated the book to him and to his work. I feel that I stood on the shoulders of a giant to then develop my work. And as we know, the human brain is incredibly complex. We have something on the order of 86 billion neurons in our brain and several hundred trillion connections. And our brain really uniquely makes us who we are. And research has shown us that no two brains are exactly identical. So we know that our brain shapes us in that it really filters our perceptions and our understanding of ourselves, of other people, of our world, and our relationship to that world. And to me, what is very exciting is this concept of neuroplasticity. So not only does our brain shape us, but if we can understand and utilize the principles of neuroplasticity, we can actually shape our brain. And that's what I wanted to talk about when I wrote this book, was my journey of discovery in terms of addressing my very, very severe and very crippling learning difficulties. So the book is both very personal, because it's my personal journey to find a solution to my difficulties, but it's also universal in that each and every one of us has a brain. We have our own strengths and weaknesses and our own cognitive profile. And I really believe that if we can understand not only our own cognitive profile, but that of others, we can have compassion and we can have insight and we can have understanding. I really am passionate about thinking about behavior through a cognitive lens, because how our brain is wired and structured really does drive and shape a lot of our behavior. So for me, my life and work has been an exploration of the territory of the human brain. And if we think about this concept of neuroplasticity, it just means that our brain is capable of change. We know that we can grow neurons, that we can increase dendrites, we can increase neurotransmitters, we can enhance neural connections, we can strengthen neural connections, we can weaken neural connections. And to me, what's really promising, especially as I'm getting older, is there's neuroplasticity across the lifespan. I've worked with people as young as 5 and as old as 81, and the 81-year-old made the same progress as a 15-year-old. So my story, though, begins many years ago. In 1951, I was born in Toronto in Canada, and I was born into a family of an educator and a social activist, that was my mother, and a scientist and an inventor, that was my father. And in grade 1, I remember very well, I started in 1957, and it was then that I discovered something was very wrong with how I understood the world. I struggled with learning how to read, I struggled with learning how to write, I struggled understanding mathematics and arithmetic, and I struggled with understanding language and comprehension. And in grade 1, my teacher told me that I had a mental block, that I was defective, and that I would never learn like other children. And to me, the message was very clear. I feel I was given a life sentence in grade 1. I was told that I needed to learn to live within my limitations. And this was the time, what I call the Pre Neuroplastic Paradigm, because the belief at that time was that your brain is fixed, it's not changeable. So if you have a learning difficulty, you need to just learn to accept it and work as hard as you can and do the best that you can. So if we imagine having a brain that's both capable and incapable at the same time, that's the experience of someone with a learning difficulty. Things that they can do with relative ease, and then things that with the best will in the world are incredibly difficult. And for me, growing up, my world was very confusing and very incomprehensible. I didn't know at that time that there were parts of my brain that weren't working the way they were designed. I couldn't understand relationships. I couldn't make connections between things. Something as simple as a fraction, because it's a relationship, a part to a whole, I couldn't understand. Language that was relational, so something is smaller or bigger, something is greater than, less than. I couldn't understand those relational concepts. I drew pictures in my notebooks to try to use my right hemisphere to draw diagrams to map language onto. I was 25, and I still could not read an analog clock. I couldn't tell time, because I couldn't understand the relationship of the hour hand to the minute hand. There was no cause and effect in my world. I didn't understand why things happened. I didn't have insight, because to have insight, you have to be able to connect information. I didn't understand jokes. There was no irony in my world. So I learned to laugh when other people did, because I didn't want to be left out. Logic didn't exist in my world. So I was very vulnerable to con artists, because one way you know you're being lied to or conned is you hear the logical inconsistencies in what someone is saying. There was no logic for me, so there were no logical inconsistencies. I got labeled in grade 1 as being stubborn and being rigid. And I truly was stubborn and rigid, but not from an emotional place. It was cognitive. I couldn't understand my world, so if I came to some limited understanding, I would hold on for dear life. And then if somebody said, think about this over here, I felt like it was an attack, because I'd have to let go of this to try to integrate the other piece of information, and that was so hard for me. Making decisions, comparing, contrasting, weighing alternatives would paralyze me. My world was like a series of puzzle pieces that never fit together, very fragmented. And eventually, that fragmented understanding of my world led to a very, very fragmented sense of myself. And that was one area that wasn't working. I had multiple learning difficulties. I couldn't register the location of sensation on the left side of my body. So it was like an alien being. My left side of my body would do things that I wasn't aware of. I learned very early that I had to watch this side of my body to stay safe. I could put my left hand on a hot burner on a stove, and my brain would tell me pain, but it wouldn't tell me that the pain was here. So I'd leave my hand on the stove. So I learned I had to watch what was going on. And my mother thought I would be dead by the age of 5 because I was so accident prone. And then I had another problem. I couldn't represent three-dimensional space in my head, so I would get lost all the time. Even in people's houses, I would get lost. I couldn't create maps. I couldn't create or interpret maps. Something as simple as crossing the street was terrifying, because when you cross the street, you create a mental map of where that car is relative to where you are. I couldn't do that. Things like geometry, geography, organic chemistry, anything where you have to go from 2 dimensions to 3-dimensional representation, I couldn't do. Those words, some assembly required, would strike terror in my heart. So this was my life, struggling to make meaning, doing very poorly in school, being abysmal in sports. Imagine me on a sports team. If a ball came at me, I would run in the other direction. And I was socially isolated because I didn't understand relationships. And I felt incredible shame. I knew something was very deeply wrong, but I didn't understand what that was or what I could do about it. And what kept me going was an attitude that I learned from my father. He was passionate about creation and creating things. And he instilled in me this belief. He said, if there's a problem and there's no solution yet in the world, he said, it's your responsibility to go out and create a solution. And then he said, if conventional wisdom or the rest of the world tells you you can't do it, he said, don't let that stop you. You go out and do it. So I was driven by that belief to try to find a solution to my difficulties. I had no idea what that would be or exactly how to do it, but I was very driven. And the other thing my father taught me was to solve a problem, the first step is you really have to understand the nature of the problem. So I remember it very well. It was August of 1977 in Toronto. My life completely changed. Somebody handed me a book. And in that book, I met a mind like mine. The person in the book was a Russian soldier, Leo Vysotsky, and he'd been injured in World War II in a battle in Russia. A bullet had gone into a part of his brain. And as I read this man's story, I thought, he is living my life, and I'm living his life. All the things that he couldn't do as a result of that wound, he could no longer tell time. He couldn't understand fractions. He couldn't understand relationships. He described meaning as being ephemeral, that it would just disappear into a fog or into a mist. I was using the same language in my journal. The book was The Man with the Shattered World, written by Alexander Luria. And Luria would describe what was going wrong in this person's brain as this soldier wrote his journal. So now I knew what my problem was. Something wasn't working right in my brain. I knew I didn't have a bullet in my brain, and that my problems had been there from birth. So now that I know what the problem is, what do I do about it? So the next line of research was Mark Rosenzweig. He was at Berkeley in California, and he was looking at this concept of neuroplasticity and working with rats, because they're a lot easier to work with than humans. And what he found was if rats had an enriched environment, stimulation, lots of toys to play with, that they became better learners. They learned mazes more quickly, more efficiently. And then what he did was he actually looked at their brains afterwards, and he found that the rats with that enrichment or stimulation, that their brains had changed physiologically and functionally. They'd actually increased in dendrites, more glia cells, and large capillaries. This was neuroplasticity in action. And I felt that if rats had neuroplasticity, surely humans must have neuroplasticity. And so I was now 26, And I saw no future for myself because everything was such a struggle. But I thought if I could take the work of Luria, understanding that cognitive function, maybe I could create a task or an activity or an exercise that would work that function, like what Rosenzweig talked about. So I ended up creating 3 very different programs and exercises, and I talk about them in my book, because there were 3 different areas that each needed a different kind of exercise or activity. And it was very, very hard work. I had no idea if it would work, but I was desperate. And over time, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of doing these exercises, making them more complex to drive more stimulation, my world changed. And I realized that there was human neuroplasticity, because I could now do things after these exercises that I could never do before, with the best will in the world. And I worked 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, slept 4 hours a night just to get through school. So I knew about hard work. But now I could do things without having to put that kind of effort in. I could listen to conversations for the first time in my life, and I could understand as people were talking to me. I used to describe that I didn't live in real time. I lived in what I called lag time, or behind time. Because I would listen to a conversation, I would memorize it, because I had a very good auditory memory, and I would walk away like a tape recorder, and I'd play that conversation over and over and over again, and then finally say, I think maybe 2 hours later that's what the person meant, but that person hadn't waited for 2 hours for me to figure it out. Now I could listen to the person, I could understand as they were talking, I could make a comment that was appropriate, and understand their comment back. It was so profound. For the first time in my life, I was part of human discourse. I could actually relate and interact and understand people. I could understand jokes. I no longer was vulnerable to con artists. I think I'm no longer rigid. Other people may feel differently. And I could tell time. I mean, I can now tell time. That wasn't the critical piece for me. It was really to change my ability to process and understand my world. And then that part of my body that was getting me into a lot of trouble, not knowing where the left side of my body was in space, because imagine if you're driving a car, and you don't know where the left side of that car is. So my car was banged and bruised just like my body was. So I addressed that problem, and now I can navigate in space. I'm not accident prone. I can actually play sports. And then the spatial reasoning, a different exercise. And now when I go places, I don't have to add in lost time. I used to always add in an extra hour anytime I went someplace, because I knew I would get lost multiple times. I can read maps, and in fact, I prefer maps to GPS, because I actually can rotate the map in my head and imagine where I'm going. And I can actually build IKEA furniture from the diagram. So I can go from that 2-dimensional diagram into 3-dimensional representation. So then this made me really curious. Obviously, not everybody had the same difficulties I had. So I started to work with people and to listen very deeply to their problems as they described them to me, and go back into Luria's work to try to understand what was causing them the difficulty. And so I went on to create more programs for different cognitive functions, from the capacity to read body language, nonverbal cues that are really critical for navigating social interactions, to visual memory that's critical for holding symbol patterns for reading or for spelling, facial recognition, so the person that can't recognize somebody's face, we've got a program for that. Auditory memory, the person that can't hold information when they hear it. To understanding numbers, quantification, numeracy, to learning motor plans necessary for writing. So a very broad range of different cognitive functions with programs to strengthen each of those. And I'm really very clear that the work I've created doesn't address everything that can impact and go wrong with learning. It's a subset of a very specific areas. And when I wrote this book, I wanted to chronicle stories from my 30-plus years of working with people, covering this range of problems. So each chapter talks about different cognitive functions and individuals, what it looks like if there is a difficulty, how you can put yourself into that person's experience to see what that might be like, and that what happens as there's cognitive transformation. And these problems don't end at the school door. As one parent said very accurately, school is just a metaphor for life. So to me, I've learned so much from all of the people that I've worked with. And this concept of, we have a concept of human error, or what I call cognitive mismatches. Again, if we can understand people's cognitive profile, we can maybe also understand some of the mistakes or difficulties people get into. I worked with a pathologist who was at a teaching hospital in New Haven, Connecticut, at Yale, and brilliant individual, lots and lots of strengths, but that part of the brain that recognizes the visual details of objects or patterns wasn't very strong. So he was looking at a slide. It was somebody that had had breast cancer. She had gone through chemotherapy and radiation, and now it was to determine, was she in remission? And he knew how important this was. So he looked really, really, really carefully. And he was really diligent. And he was just about to sign off that the person was in remission when his supervisor came and said, "Didn't you see these cells up here? This is cancer." And it wasn't that he hadn't seen them, he hadn't recognized them. So he came out of his program, we worked on that function, and now he can do that recognition. I had a pilot, anybody that flies, that had that auditory memory problem. And as he was flying into air traffic control space, his problem was he couldn't remember what the air traffic controller had told him. And so his strategy was to get the air traffic controller to repeat the instructions several times so he could remember them. My fear was if you're flying into Chicago O'Hare or, say, a busy airport in Europe, what if that air traffic controller can only say it once and he couldn't remember it? So I would always ask him if I was flying, where was he flying, and make sure I wasn't flying in the same airspace. The better solution was he addressed that problem and now he can hold the information. I worked with a butcher, so his job was, sharp knife here, cutting things, and he didn't know, he had the same problem of not knowing where his left side was. So the first day I met him, his whole left arm was in bandages because he was cutting himself accidentally. And I worked with somebody on the Olympic ski jump team who had, again, that mild kinesthetic problem for him, but when you're coming down those chutes very quickly, you have to very much know where your body is in space, so he would tend to fall. If you all go to the dentist, you want your dentist to have really good spatial ability, right? Because you want him to look at that x-ray or her and map on to the right tooth and not drill the wrong tooth. There are lots and lots of stories of people that I've met over the years and how some of the difficulties they had have really interfered with what they are trying to do in their life. But the positive news is these can be addressed and then the person can carry out those activities. This book, I'm very excited, has the new chapter 24 in it that was just written last summer. And in that chapter, we talk about some of the research that's going on. There's research at University of British Columbia in Vancouver. There's research at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois, where we're doing the researchers are doing imaging research as well as cognitive testing and academic testing. And they're seeing changes in the brains of individuals going through this program, changes in the attention control network, the executive control network, and regions related to numeracy, abstract thinking, sensory integration. So that's described in that chapter. And one of the things that breaks my heart is that individuals with learning difficulties talk about not daring to dream. At a certain point, and I know in my life, I stopped dreaming of a future or possibilities for myself. And a lot of the adults, because we work with adults as well, talk about how they feel their career was chosen for them. When they got to that point, there were so many doors closed that there might be only one or two that they could walk through. And what I think this work does is it gives them the cognitive wherewithal now to have multiple choices. It opens up possibilities, so there are multiple doors open. Maybe they would choose that same door, but at least now they have choice. And I just want to end, sadly I can't read it in Spanish, but it is in the Spanish translation. This is my vision for this work, and I feel so grateful that this vision is being realized here in the SEC international schools and at the university, so thank you. So my vision is of a world in which no child ever struggles with a learning disability. No child is ever stigmatized as having one, and no child experiences the ongoing emotional pain of living with a learning disability. My vision is for all schools to become places where children can go to strengthen their brains so they can learn effectively and efficiently. Cognitive exercises using the principles of neuroplasticity will become an integral part of each school's curriculum. In this way, learning problems can be addressed early as part of regular curriculum, and students without cognitive deficits will all benefit from cognitive stimulation. That people with learning disabilities don't dare to dream breaks my heart. We now have the tools to address these problems, strengthen and rewire and improve their brains, and avoid a tremendous amount of needless suffering. I'm passionate about this work, about its ability to change and improve lives. My daily prayer is that this work, grounded in compassion, its integrity uncompromised, goes out into the world with ease and grace. So I thank you, and it's a pleasure.